Washington Talk, I'm Eun Cho. The United States and North Korea have revived their stalled denuclearization talks. Just days before talks with the United States, North Korea tested an underwater-launched missile. Is the latest round of negotiations the beginning of tangible progress?
대용의 잠수함 탄도탄 북극성 3형 시험 발사의 성공은 조선민주주의 인민공화국에 대한 외부 세력의 위협을 억제하고
We'll see. They want to talk and we'll be talking to them soon. We'll see.
In the studio with me today, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea and to Russia and was Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Ambassador, so after the breakdown of the Hanoi summit back in February, the working level talks are finally starting. So what is the significance of this meeting?
Well, it is significant that it's happening because there are doubts that the North Koreans were going to follow through on the promise that they made to President Trump at the DMZ meeting in June. So at least they're interested in talking. Now, whether they're interested in actually making progress remains to be seen. They've been trying to put pressure on the United States since the end of the Hanoi meeting, saying it's the U.S. that has to make all the concessions. So we'll see if there's any flexibility in the North Korean position, and we'll know that very soon.
Mm-hmm. So how is the environment when these working level talks are being held?
Well, I think the atmosphere and timing for this round of talks is not good, especially because of the North Korean show of strength related to the submarine-launched ballistic missile test, and also because of some internal signals that the North Koreans have been sending, re-emphasizing military strength and seemingly going back toward more of a Byungjin-type approach, simultaneously pursuing economic and military development. And so I just think that the fact that Kim Jong-un has spent so much time with the scientists and so little time with the economics-focused people over the summer is not a good sign for what we can expect for these talks.
Mm-hmm. And what should be the minimum goal achieved from this meeting?
Well, the main thing that we've been trying to do, I think, from the very beginning is to get a process started where both sides can try to close the gap. And the way to do that is by agreeing on corresponding actions that can be taken to make this denuclearization and peace process into a jointly owned process. But we haven't begun that yet, and so it really raises questions about whether the North Koreans want to actually achieve that objective.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, if you could add to the minimum goal achieved?
Well, I agree with Scott that just establishing a continuing process at the working level would be a step in the right direction because top-down diplomacy, more summits are not likely to be able to address the very challenging details of a denuclearization agreement. I would hope that they could go a little further than just agreeing to talk by actually coming closer to defining what is the goal? What does denuclearization mean? That very basic question has not yet been answered in any of the summit meetings to date. And that, I think, is the prerequisite to starting to chart out a roadmap that would lead to denuclearization over a series of stages, as well as progress on the other tracks, peace regime, normalization of relations, security guarantees. Getting all that done in this meeting is asking too much, but hopefully they can start moving in that direction.
Mm-hmm. And the U.S. media reports that the United States plans to propose freezing sanctions for 36 months on textiles and core exports of North Korea in exchange for closure of Yongbyon and stop enrichment of uranium. Back in July, South Korean media reported similar things, just that the timing was 12 to 18 months. So why do you think there are similar reports on what potential U.S. proposal may be?
Well, somebody is leaking what could be the U.S. position. I don't know if it's true, but I think if anything in that general ballpark is what the U.S. has in mind, I think it's encouraging, because it's unrealistic to expect that there will be one giant big bang in which everything is agreed at once. There inevitably is going to have to be a step-by-step, incremental approach. And putting at least some of the sanctions on the table, as long as the suspension can be reversed with a snapback provision, I think is essential to put Kim Jong-un to the test. So we'll see if that is exactly the U.S. proposal, but I hope it signals a little bit more realism about the need for a step-by-step approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I would suggest that we need to be very careful about the snapback if there is indeed some kind of specified sanctions lifting or relaxation, because we need to make sure that it's possible to put the sanctions back in place. And I worry that under the UN Security Council resolutions, that in fact, if we're talking about relying on the Chinese or the Russians to reimpose sanctions after a period of relaxation, that might be a formula for irreversibility rather than reversibility in proportion to a reversible step by North Korea in terms of allowing us into Yongbyon.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, this is your expertise. So the working level delegation, when they get there on the ground, will they have the power to give what North Korea wants, the sanctions relief and the regime survival?
Well, I hope that the U.S. negotiator, Steve Biegun, will have some clear proposals that put the ball into the North Korean court in terms of starting the process of developing an incremental approach. And I assume that because he'll bring along people from the other agencies, he'll have some ability to make decisions on the spot to offer alternatives or compromises if the negotiations become serious. I'm not so sure the North Korean negotiators will have that much latitude. They'll probably lay out their position, but report any new ideas back to Pyongyang before being able to compromise.
Mm-hmm. And former National Security Advisor Ambassador Bolton said that North Korea will never give up nuclear weapons voluntarily, and that at one point people should start considering regime change and military action against North Korea. So is this considered radical or a majority view in Washington?
Well, I think it may be the majority view. People are very pessimistic that Kim Jong-un, now that he's invested so much of his resources and prestige in nuclear weapons and feeling it's the ultimate security guarantee for himself, that he'll agree to give all of them up. I think he's hoping to have his cake and eat it too, get the benefits of a deal on normalization of relations and security guarantees while keeping at least a few of his nuclear weapons. But I remain an optimist that there might be terms of a bargain in which he would see that he's better off giving up his nukes. But we may not know that overnight. We may have to do this in stages and taking a certain amount of risk, hoping that we can move from one stage to another and not see Kim Jong-un renege on any long-term commitment to denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. And what's notable about Ambassador Bolton's continued pessimistic remarks about the Trump administration's policy on North Korea?
Well, I personally feel that now that Ambassador Bolton is back out in the public eye, that the regime change note is going to be sounded as part of the discussion fairly regularly. And one interesting question is whether that starts to get under the skin of the North Koreans. I don't think that it necessarily has to translate into influencing the Trump administration's approach on diplomacy, but I wouldn't be surprised if the North Koreans began to see influences where they really shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. And just 13 hours after North Korea said it will return to the working level talks, North Korea launched a missile, and Seoul believes this is submarine-launched ballistic missile, and Pentagon says that this was launched from a sea-based platform. So what was North Korea's intention behind this?
Well, of course, it was a show of strength in advance of talks, but I think there's also clearly a technical component in terms of expanding the platform for North Korea to achieve its deterrence and nuclear survivability objectives, because having a naval capability to launch nuclear weapons does improve survivability. It shortens warning time. And so there is, I think, perhaps a perceived value on the part of the North Koreans in terms of attaining that capability related to their deterrence objectives.
What do you make of North Korea's latest submarine-launched ballistic missile? And President Trump, when asked if North Korea had gone a step too far, he said, "We'll see." So he downplayed North Korea's missile launch again. What will be the repercussions?
Well, first, I agree with Scott that this is first and foremost a show of strength on the eve of talks, which is a sort of standard tactic by the North Koreans. So that in of itself is not surprising, but I do agree also that this represents a significant enhancement of the North Korean capability. Moving from land-based to sea-based systems does make dealing with the challenge, including defending against it with ballistic missile defense, more difficult. But I think it also is a message that the North Korean program is continuing to advance, and the U.S. is going to have to pay a very high price if it really wants to get them to reverse some of these programs. So President Trump continuing to downplay these things, I think, is beginning to lose credibility because, and here's where Bolton made some very good points in his speech the other day when he said that even without testing intercontinental missiles, tests of medium-range missiles, of the sea-based missiles, all enhances the reliability, the accuracy of North Korean systems and makes the threat more serious and more complex rather than less.
What do you make of President Trump downplaying again now a submarine-launched ballistic missile?
Well, what I worry about is that he's sending a permissive signal for more tests. And I think that in this area, especially related to the sea-based capability, the North Koreans probably have a few more tests to go. Interestingly, some of the reports from the current test suggest that the missile came down in two pieces rather than one. We don't know exactly how successful it was, but I think it's safe to say that they need more of those kinds of tests in order to have a deployable capability.
And China and Russia, they celebrate the 70th anniversary of their diplomatic ties, and they also came up with a proposal to the Korean Peninsula issue, which is called Action Plan on Comprehensive Solution to the Korean Peninsula Issue. So what do you make of the collaboration between China and Russia and its impact to the nuclear denuclearization issue?
Well, the closer and closer alliance between China and Russia is an important strategic development for the region as a whole, not just with respect to North Korea. And I think this is why the Trump administration has increasingly talked about an era of great power competition with China and Russia as the two main competitors. When it comes to the specific issue of North Korea, I think Beijing and Moscow are saying they want to be in the game, that they have interests as well. And I think they did a bit of show of force themselves when they violated Korean airspace a few weeks ago, not accidentally in the territory also claimed by Japan. So I think they're sort of telling us that they're a force to be reckoned with, and that we should be consulting with them as we pursue these negotiations ourselves.
Well, I agree with Ambassador Vershbow that we have not seen China-Russia collaboration of this sort in the Pacific theater for a long time. It is a new factor that I think that the U.S. military is going to have to be prepared to take into account as we pursue our defense objectives in the Asia-Pacific.
And after the working level talks, what should be the important follow-up measures?
More working level talks. I mean, I think that in order for the two sides to close the gap, we need to see a sustained process as evidence that they're actually working toward and making progress. We don't want talks for the sake of talks, but the reality of the complexity of the North Korea issue is that they're not going to be able to do everything in 2 days. And so I want to see them take breaks, come back to talks, show the same kind of seriousness of purpose that we have seen maybe on other occasions, the agreed framework or six-party talks.
What's important in the days ahead, in the months ahead?
Well, I agree, just continuing the process is important. We shouldn't rush to another summit because the kinds of technical details that need to be worked out in any denuclearization deal, even if it's done in stages, require a lot more work at the working level. But I would hope that these talks can begin to focus on what the U.S. and many experts have been talking about, which is a roadmap that shows what steps the North Koreans will take on denuclearization in year 1, year 2, what corresponding actions the U.S. will take in terms of diplomatic normalization, what the security guarantees will be, and of most interest to the North Koreans, what kinds of economic incentives and relief from the sanctions they can expect if they deliver on each of the milestones. So that's what this negotiation ultimately is about, and we'll know whether they're succeeding or failing if such a roadmap can or cannot be produced.
So we'll keep our eyes on the future negotiations, and now we'll leave it here and move on to our next discussion.
And we certainly hope Korea will make the decision to return to Jisomi before the deadline of November 22nd.
So I'm aware of the strains in that relationship, but the United States, I would say, strongly believes that the integrity of our mutual defense and security ties must persist.
In recent weeks, senior U.S. officials repeatedly called on South Korea to recommit to the intelligence sharing agreement with Japan before the deadline on November 22nd. South Korea says it will only reconsider if Japan retracts the tighter export controls. Now, Mr. Snyder, Undersecretary of Defense John Rood, Assistant Secretary of Defense Shriver, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Mark Knapper, they all called on South Korea to reconsider their decision. So what's behind this strong messaging to Seoul?
Well, the message is that it's in the U.S. interest to see a stable Japan-South Korea relationship, and we see the Jisomiya agreement between Japan and South Korea as an important institutional symbol of Japan-South Korea cooperation and security. And so I think it's been made very clear that that's the way the U.S. would like to see South Korea go, and it imposes costs on the Moon administration if they choose to move in a different direction.
And these calls comes despite Seoul's request to not make those similar public remarks.
Well, that's true. The South Koreans have their own idea about where they want this to go. They want the U.S. to take it on and play more of a mediating role. But that puts the U.S. into a very complex position. And I think the first step is for South Korea to reconsider the non-renewal decision. And then we can move forward in addressing other areas of the relationship.
And Ambassador Vershbow, do you think the Trump administration is taking a more bigger role than initially on this issue?
Well, it looks like they're playing a bigger role after being kind of passive when this issue first started to unfold. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's very dangerous, and it weakens our alliance with South Korea when these kinds of issues get politicized. I mean, there's already politicization of the historical disputes and of trade, but politicizing the security relationship doesn't just undermine Korea's interests, it undermines U.S. interests. So I hope some way can be found, some face-saving solution can be found that would allow South Korea to reverse its decision and let the agreement stay into effect. We just saw why it's so important with this recent North Korean missile test. Getting intelligence from Japan, I think, was very valuable to South Korea, and they're only hurting themselves by letting it lapse.
And the series of military meetings between the three countries, Korea-U.S. Integrated Defense Dialogue, meeting among the Joint Chiefs of Staffs and the meeting among the defense ministers. So how would this help resolve this issue?
Well, first, I just want to say I agree absolutely with Ambassador Vershbow that the North Koreans are making the best case for retaining the Japan-South Korea information sharing agreement. But from a U.S. perspective, it's really about continuing to support institutionalized trilateral cooperation, in some ways as a bridge and as a safe space for Japan and South Korea to be able to continue dialogue on critical security issues.
And on that institutionalizing point, what do you make of the series of military meetings between the three countries?
Well, I think it's a good thing that these meetings take place. There shouldn't be shying away from having some kind of trilateral dialogue. We may never have a trilateral alliance, but I think enhancing communication when we're dealing with common threats, whether it's North Korea or rising China, all these things argue for having these kinds of exchanges among our military commanders. And maybe they can help the politicians who have the final say find a way to keep the Jisomiya going beyond November.
And what do you make of the latest U.S.-ROK relations, and when compared to the Roh Moo-hyun administration when you were the ambassador to South Korea?
Well, the relationship is in many ways better, particularly on the trade side. We were still struggling over the FTA when I was ambassador. Now we not only have it, but we've managed to improve it and avoid a trade dispute between the Trump administration and the Moon Jae-in administration. On the other hand, this Jisomiya is a setback. I also think that the upcoming negotiations on the Special Measures Agreement, where the U.S. is demanding a five-fold increase, which I think is totally unjustified, could lead to a real deterioration of our military relationship. But I think one thing I remember from my time with Roh Moo-hyun, who had many differences with President Bush and was a difficult character to deal with sometimes, but he always sort of said that protecting and improving the alliance was essential at all times, and he tried very well to insulate the alliance from our wider political relationship. I think that's a good example to follow today.
You know, one of the great assets that exists now that was less strong at the time of the Presidents Bush and Noh is South Korean public support for the alliance. And really, this is kind of the bridgehead that I think helps us to manage in potentially choppy waters, but it is also an asset that can rapidly be eroded if indeed, for instance, U.S. positions on burden sharing look like they're too extreme. And so I think we have to watch public opinion very carefully and adjust our positions in order to make sure that we manage those cost-sharing issues effectively in the alliance relationship.
Before we go, how heavily do you think the cost-sharing issue will weigh on the bilateral relations?
Well, it remains to be seen. I think the worry is that if it becomes politicized, it could become a real drag on the relationship. But you know, it also is an ongoing issue that every alliance partner has with the United States and that we have to manage. President Trump is taking a slightly more aggressive approach, but at the same time, I do think you could argue for a possible adjustment, just not at the extreme level that President Trump has called for in the initial negotiating position.
Well, we'll leave it here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of Pyongyang Sunan Airport in mid-September. British ambassador to North Korea, Colin Crooks, posted on his Twitter that Pyongyang Airport was quietly bustling. On this day, there were 2 international flights to Beijing and Vladivostok and 1 domestic flight to Cheongjin. Mr. Snyder, what's your reaction?
Well, it looks like a duty-free shop that could be in just about any airport in the world. The air traffic, I think, between Pyongyang and other countries is still pretty low. But you know, in a way, I think it's a picture of North Korea wanting to take part in the world, especially commercially, and yet they remain isolated.
Ambassador Vershbow?
I agree with what Scott has just said. I mean, it does show that North Korea is trying to come out from its isolation and becoming more of a normal country. And I think it shows the influence of some of the economic changes that have been taking place. But it also suggests perhaps that the sanctions aren't being enforced very well, and that these kinds of increased economic exchanges with the outside world are happening despite the sanctions. And suggest that we don't have as much leverage as we should in going into these talks on denuclearization.
On that note, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Ambassador Vershbow, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.